Good evening. Thank you so much. Hello. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight for this highly important conversation about what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia at the moment. My name is Elena Sudakova. I'm a director here at Pushkin House, which is a cultural center and a forum for exchange, dialogue, and interpretation. And as a cultural center, as a Russian cultural center, we feel it's very important to make our position clear. And we stand in solidarity with Ukrainian people, and we condemn Russian military invasion and aggression, which is already affecting millions of Ukrainian people at the moment. And on this note, I would like to pass on to Grigor Atenisyan, who is a journalist from BBC News Russia, who will introduce our esteemed panel of speakers for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Good evening. As you all know, this week Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, its neighbor and, fair to say, former brotherly nation. Right now, as we speak, Russian military is trying to seize the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. The situation is shocking, it's tragic, but it is by no means unexpected or surprising. In fact, military experts and international leaders have been predicting this exact scenario for months now. So how did we end up here, and what is a possible way out of this crisis? To discuss this and other questions, we are privileged to have here, first via video link. Unfortunately, Sir Lawrence couldn't be here with us tonight, but Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. We also have Dr. Julie Newton, who is a principal investigator of the University Consortium and an expert on Russian foreign policy. And we also have Alena Khlivko. She has an extensive experience in the Ukrainian politics, and she now works as a strategic relations manager at the Henry Jackson Society here in London. I want to start with Sir Lawrence. Sir Lawrence, we, the journalists, we call this war unprecedented, but you have studied and chronicled many modern wars, and so could you please tell us where are we now, and does this resemble you something that you've witnessed before?
I think it's an unusual war. I mean, there's a lot of precedents for war, but this is indeed going back to 2014. There was aggression against Ukraine. But what is staggering about this is, on the one hand, the scale of the Russian preparations and the operation. But on the other hand, after now a couple of days of operations, just how poorly planned it appears to be. I think most military analysts, I mean, I was always skeptical about whether Putin would do this, precisely for the reasons that are now transpiring, is that it's very difficult to occupy a country which is geographically the size of France, of well over 40 million people. But I did assume that they'd worked out a military strategy, even if it wasn't clear what their political strategy was. But actually, their military strategy seems rather chaotic. Now, that doesn't mean to say, and I have to emphasize this, that they're not they're not a strong military position, but they've got a problem coming up. And the problem is this: the Ukrainians are essentially defending their cities. They've allowed, they haven't tried to stop all movement of Russian forces through Ukrainian territory. They're defending their cities. That poses a real challenge, because to take cities, you've got to be prepared for urban warfare. The Russians have got experience in Chechnya and elsewhere, but urban warfare is not a simple matter. tanks are of limited value, often depending on the narrowness of the streets and so on. Or you do what they did in Grozny and Aleppo, and you really bombard the civilian population. But we're already seeing that within Russia itself, there is great unhappiness about what's going on. This is not a distant conflict for Western countries. The Western media is there, they can see what's going on. So just doing the sort of thing they did in Grozny is not really possible, I don't think, in Kiev. And of course, you know, Chechnya is what, 1 million people, if that. This is a much more substantial challenge. So I think Putin has created a real problem for himself, and that the military are going to have to take some pretty tough decisions quite soon. And also they're losing people. I mean, the numbers that we're hearing, which only come from the Ukrainian side because the Russians are not giving numbers of their own casualties. So you know, take the numbers with a pinch of salt, but they're high. And there's enough social media demonstrations of lost equipment and so on. And there's a basic strategic fact that it's different to fight for your country than to invade a country. So for all these reasons, I don't, again, we have to stress it's early days, but this isn't going well for Russia. And I think politically, he's got a lot of problems because the idea that you could install a puppet regime in Kiev, given that all we know that has happened in the past, in the Orange Revolution, 2045, Euromaidan, 2013-14, the idea that this is a population that's just going to accept an illegitimate puppet. And it's my final point, it makes you realize that actually this is a war that was conjured up in the imagination of one man who probably believes his own propaganda, that the government in Ukraine is somehow installed through an American plot, that Ukraine isn't a proper country and there's no Ukrainian national identity. And it's really a staggering indictment of the development of the Russian political system over the last 2 decades that has allowed a situation to develop in which this one man, who, as we saw on Monday, intimidating his own Security Council, can get into a position where he can order an operation of this size without thinking it through, without really having a serious strategy to bring it to a close. So it creates a very dangerous and disturbing situation, very frightening for those in the middle of it. But whatever one can say, I don't think this is going to look as a clear and simple Russian victory in the near future.
I see. Thank you. Julie, Sir Lawrence said that he was skeptical until Thursday that Putin will launch a full-scale invasion that was predicted. He wasn't alone in that. Russia's best analysts, foreign policy experts, and a lot of people here in the West as well were skeptical about this scenario. Why do you think is that? Do you think people expected Putin to act logically and he ended up acting irrationally?
Thank you, Grigor. And I think that the mindset, especially amongst the foreign policy community in Moscow, was just stunned by this. I mean, the mindset was such that, all right, coercion probably needs to happen because the West is not going to agree to the 3 principal demands that Putin and Lavrov put forward back in December. And those were no more NATO expansion, to move equipment back to 1997, and to completely begin to demilitarize parts of NATO. So those 3 demands were non-starters for the West, and they thought, well, the only way that Putin will be able to get his way is through extreme coercive bargaining. And so a lot of the foreign policy elite bought into that idea. From all the various institutions, I think there was a consensus that, well, you know, all right, coercion may be counterproductive, but it is true that we've been trying for 30 years, and we can talk about that later, but maybe now coercion, in fact, there was one guy at MGIMO who wrote a very interesting article saying, our biggest problem is that we don't really use threats very well, and we're gonna have to use coercive bargaining, and this is the time to do it. And we can also talk about why they thought this was the time to do it. And I think in a lot of ways, most of the foreign policy community people felt like he would go to the brink and then pull back. In fact, Dmitry Trenin, who is head of the Carnegie Moscow Institute, said on Monday that the idea was that he would use coercive bargaining right to the very last minute, see how far he could get. Certainly, he really didn't expect to get that far, so he was absolutely ready to invade, as we know, from the various other military experts who knew that this could come, but he wanted to test the West. All right, so they didn't do it, but most of the people thought he won't go overboard. They will pull back. He'll either change his mind and pull back, or that maybe by Monday, especially after Monday's speech, when, as Sir Lawrence said, he sort of dressed down his National Security Council, okay, well then just take the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic, and maybe possibly even the Oblast, but no more. So they thought there was no way that they would go for war. But coercive bargaining was something that I think the foreign policy community of Russia, of Moscow, did embrace, because they felt like there was no other way to get their, really to resolve their European security dilemma, which Ukraine is the very center of that.
Thank you, Julie. Let's maybe get a view from Kyiv now. Alyona, until this week, the Ukrainian government was not willing to talk about the possible Russian full-scale invasion, and they were actually accusing the West of panicking. What's the mood in Kyiv right now?
Thank you, Grigor, for having me. And before I answer your question, I do want to thank Pushkin House for holding this event and for standing up against war, along with hundreds of thousands of other Russian citizens who suffered greatly yesterday during the meetings and were detained and are now in jails. And we know that there's even punishment up to 5 years for just going out to protest and speak up. I know it's not easy, and I'm sure that every Ukrainian appreciates every single voice against war in Russia. Now back to Kyiv. I think the reason why Kyiv authorities were not supporting the Western narrative of announcing invasion every single day is because at the end of the day, you have to look at it from the perspective of local authorities. They have a huge, massive country to run. We need to remember the size of Ukraine. It's around 40 million citizens. It's the biggest country in Europe. And if you allow any panic happen preeminently before any invasion even happens, when people go towards ATMs, take out all the money, when they start fleeing the country, when the panic is there, then there's very little chance to stand up to any potential invasion altogether. So I think even listening to all the military intelligence that President was getting, I know that their infamous sang-froid was discussed here in the West very widely. Why is Zelensky not falling for this narrative? I think they understood every single threat, but they did try to just be calm and try to keep the country mobilized, but also not go into panic mode. And I would like to briefly build on what Sir Lawrence said about the success of Russian action so far. And indeed, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is reporting around 1,000 Russian soldiers dead just today, just in the second day of invasion. Now, we don't have the confirmation from those numbers apart from Ministry of Defense, but we do see dozens of tanks and planes and helicopters and serious fighting, as you just mentioned, in Kyiv. 18,000 rifles have been given away to territorial defense battalions, which are basically volunteers from Kyiv citizens. I have just seen an update that they've also received the anti-tank defense weapons that were provided by British, just local volunteers in Kyiv, to fight off any tanks in the streets of Kyiv. So the invasion has not possibly been as successful as Putin planned, and Hristo Groziev, who is an investigator who's focusing widely on Russia, just also reported that, according to his information, Putin has put a deadline to his closest team of people of Tuesday. They need to finish this military operation by Tuesday, seize Kyiv, install military regime. Otherwise, he's going to have some serious internal figuring out to do.
If I may, I also wanted to ask you, because this must feel personal, do you have family there right now?
I do. Thankfully, I think this was one of the several times in my brief history of my life where I've thanked God that I was born in the west of Ukraine, because so far it's been quite quiet there. I come from the city of Chernivtsi, which is on the border with Romania. And thankfully, unlike other Western cities like Rivne, Lviv, or Ivano-Frankivsk, we had no explosions so far, knock on wood. We do have an influx of refugees from the east at the moment, and of course, many people are fleeing to Romania through our region. So for now, thankfully, everyone is safe, but of course, we have mass mobilization announced in Ukraine, and I'm expecting my brother to be conscripted anytime now.
Let's hope your family stays safe. And President Zelensky, in his addresses yesterday and today, talked about sense of betrayal. Ukraine seems to be really disappointed with the West.
Well, I think that's also the reason why President Zelensky is so outspoken, because with all the reports, constant, never-ending reports of the dates of invasion, of the possible schemes, we all seen those red arrows on screens with journalists explaining, according to Western intelligence, of where the Russian troops are going to come from. No actions to deter that were prepared. Where is the imminent reaction? Where the everything is on the table, nothing is off limits, and where's the swift
What would
reaction?
you want to see? Which exact reaction?
I think the first sanctions from Western capitals came in some 16 hours after the Russian invasion. I think Ukrainians were definitely expecting that to happen sooner, to have any sort of reaction. I think President Biden said many times that unless it's a minor incursion, which I'm sure we can disregard that now, it's definitely not a minor incursion, that the harshest sanctions will be implemented. And we saw even the first wave of sanctions was just pathetic, sanctioning banks that didn't even have assets abroad, sanctioning oligarchs that were already sanctioned since 2014. And just now, I think, slowly building on that and just seeing that it's not enough. I think thanks to also all the outpour of support for Ukrainian people from Ukrainians, from many other nations, only now Western capitals are kind of rethinking their strategy, uniting. We saw the EU's reaction, we saw NATO's reaction today after the virtual summit, and I think that Downing Street is finally getting to cracking down on all the oligarchs in London.
Julie, I wanted to get more to the core of the arguments fueling this war and fueling this invasion. When we look at the Russian official position and the security demands which you just listed that Russia presented last year, we see an odd mix of President Putin's personal grievances and his very personal focus on Ukraine. But we also saw narratives and demands and concerns that have been there forever, since President Gorbachev and then President Yeltsin, who all wanted to stop NATO expansion and who also former Soviet Union as essentially Russia's sphere of influence. So is it possible to untangle, to divorce Putin and his obsessions from Russia's position? And is it even worth doing?
Thank you, Grigor. It's the million-dollar question is what is driving this? And I think it's the essential question to try analyze the complexity of it, because the answer is, I think, extremely complex. It's easy, I think, to answer in a rather simplistic way and say, yes, it's either all Putin or it's just Russian nature to be imperialistic, to go back and try to rebuild the Soviet Union. It's just the way Russians are. I've been listening to that all week. And in fact, I think the answer is much more of an action-reaction dynamic between Russia and the West for the last 30 years. It's much more contingent, depending on the series of events that have happened over the last 30 years, where Russia-West relations started up here at a high in 1989 and have steadily gone down to 2014, where they fell off the cliff when Russia took Crimea, and now they're down below the axis, heading down into, we're certainly in Cold War. We were in Cold War, I believe, in 2014, but perhaps we can argue about that as well, because that's a very interesting academic argument as to whether at what point we have reached Cold War, but I think we're there now. But the point is that there were what you could call original sins on both sides that have driven this dynamic that has led us to where we are now. And let's just start, just for the sake of it, with the Russian original sins, because I think it's something that not only Putin has done, but it started even with the Yeltsin government, where they dismissed right from the start the legitimate security concerns of their neighbors. I mean, Russia tended to think, oh, well, the Poles, the Balts, they're just small countries. What difference do they really make? And it's interesting because some of the scholars at some of the best Russian institutes back in 1994 would say to me, we need to go back to the Poles, we need to go to the Balts and have some kind of truth and reconciliation, really committees and meetings with this, so that we can begin to rebuild trust, because there is no trust in our relationship. But Russia didn't do that. They went straight to NATO and went straight to the United States, because great powers only deal with great powers. So you dismiss the security concerns of your neighbors. And then from there it goes on for the next 30 years of dismissing the security interest of its neighbors. And here we see now they're not just dismissing that, at war. But certainly the original sin on the Western side is NATO expansion. It starts with NATO expansion in a way that dismissed Russia's security interest. Russia felt that it had given up its empire in exchange for being integrated into Western institutions in some meaningful way. And it's a very complicated issue to say, I don't appreciate the arguments that said, NATO expansion just should never have happened, but it was so complicated the way it did happen, and there were perhaps ways of doing it slower, or ways of taking into consideration Russia's legitimate security interests, particularly given the fact that the Soviet Empire had just collapsed, and you had 25 million Russians in different Soviet former republics, the biggest diaspora practically in history, 11 million in Ukraine. So how does Russia deal with that? And I don't think the West gave enough thought of these very painful issues. And so they just went ahead and expanded NATO in ways that excluded Russia, and then continued all the way through with Western actions, again, action-reaction between the West and Russia, Russia dismissing its neighbors, the West dismissing the security interests of Russia. And let's just take an example of 2008, when you have a NATO summit where NATO issues a membership action plan to Ukraine and to NATO, and it was even at that point.
To Georgia. Ukraine and Georgia.
Yeah, Ukraine and Georgia. And at that point, Putin said, please don't do this. This is too much of the crucible of our civilization. Once you get into that, and even before that, back in 1999, you had people like Primakov, who was foreign minister and then prime minister, who said, do not, to Javier Solana, who was Secretary General of NATO at the time, said, do not expand NATO into the former Soviet space. For God's sake, not into Ukraine and Georgia, because no Russian leader will be able to tolerate that. Anyway, you move on to just even the European Union then dismissed Russian legitimate economic concerns with the nature of its economic proposals to Ukraine that didn't take into consideration the economic losses for Russia. So I'm hardly an apologist for Russia. What they've done today is despicable, beyond. But I think one needs to at least look at the history of the resentment, to separate it from the one man of Putin and to realize that even within the foreign policy community of Russia, these grievances are there, they're going to be there, and we need to pick those apart and separate those from Putin's outrageous reaction. The problem is there, the way, typical for Putin, the way he deals with problems makes problems worse for Russia and the world.
What Julie just said rings very true to me. From all what I read and see in the Russian foreign policy community, there can be a lot of disgust to this current war, but there's a lot of blame in Russia put on NATO long term, even among people who despise Putin, who vote against him. But Alena, I think the view from Ukraine would be very different because, as I understand it, and you would be in position to actually say it, but Ukraine doesn't want to be a post-Soviet state forever. It wants to join NATO and European Union when it wants, not when Russia is ready and if Russia is ready.
I think certainly Ukrainians want to be able to choose their own future. That is the predicament of independence, isn't it? And I think that's where Ukrainians were striving for centuries. It's not just the last 30 years that Ukrainians have been independent and it came as a surprise. And of course we are somewhat learning to be an independent state and build our own foreign policies as well as internal ones. But Ukrainians have been striving for that independence and unity for centuries if you look at our history. So of course it's frustrating when over and over again we have empire, whether to the east or to the west, that just tries to decide that future for us. And I do agree with Julie that perhaps things should have been handled differently. Perhaps the West should have looked at Russia closely as the USSR was falling apart. But realistically, I've joined an event at Chatham House today, and there was an interesting thought there when one of the researchers said that actually we are still witnessing Russian empire falling apart. It hasn't finished of that process. That's why it's so painful for it. In our views, in the views of all of the world, in the views of Ukrainians, we've been independent for 30 years. The situation is very different. We're all separate states. We have our history. We have our future aspirations. Whereas for Russia, it still feels like it's losing its identity. It's losing its territory, sphere of influence. And there's perhaps that historical feeling of shame that forces Putin to act the way he acts. But of course, it doesn't help that he perpetuates some of those ideas, and eventually I think he did start to believe those myths that he created himself. I think first and foremost, we could perhaps single out 3 narratives within Putin's head why he's justifying that. As we know, every internal problem in Russia, when they try to solve it, rather than raising the level of life for people, rather than making Russia successful country economic-wise, freedom-wise, giving people liberty that they need and some sort of level of dignity just to be able to live and not survive, he rather focuses on the external policies and he diverts attention. And even now, we've been seeing, it hasn't started just in 2014, even though we saw that as soon as he starts cracking down on opposition, when he starts murdering opposition journalists, when he poisons his #1 contester at the presidential elections, Navalny, imprisons him, that's when he decides to act on external international arena as well, just to bring legitimacy for himself in the eyes of his own population. As we saw last year in January 2021, Russia broke out with one of the biggest protests in their history after Bolotnaya, and they were severely cracked down, and that's when Navalny returned. He was imprisoned. Now, while Russia is leading war on Ukraine, at the same time we have a trial going on for Navalny, another trial that will imprison him for another 10 years, and who knows if we will see him come out alive of this. So that's the first reason internally why he acts that way. Secondly, of course, he never in his head would allow Ukraine to be independent. I suppose he still views it again as its province. He gains his sense of satisfaction and confidence, I suppose, because Ukraine was also the richest Soviet republic. All of Kremlin elites and back in the Soviet Union, all of the ЦК KPSS elites, most of them came from Ukraine. Ukraine contributed very heavily to Soviet Union. So he, of course, it's painful for him to see that something so valuable is slipping away. And the third narrative is, of course, security reasons and just that embarrassment that he wasn't able to justify himself and to be one of those global powers. Because, you know, for the last 2 years, even the US was saying, Russia is not a threat. We don't care about 2 separatist territories in Ukraine. We're not getting involved in that. Let them have Crimea. Our main focus is China, Indo-Pacific. Britain has announced as soon as they left the EU and they started building their global Britain agenda, Liz Truss announced that Indo-Pacific tilt is #1 focus. And I'm sure he did not like that. I'm sure that was perhaps a trigger for him to show the world that he is also #1 reason for concern.
Thank you, Alena. Julie, I know that you have also done... Oh, yes, sorry. Sir Lawrence?
Can I come in a bit? There's quite a lot of things have been said. First, just to correct, if you look at the integrated review, it did not say, very definitely didn't say, that the UK was moving away from Europe. That was always the prime security threat. The Indo-Pakistan thing, sorry, the Indo-Pacific thing was an added dimension, but it's important to note, and I think you can see it with the Belarus as well as with Russia and Ukraine. The UK has been quite focused on that. I just wanted to say something about the enlargement issue. I was an opponent of enlargement in the early 90s. I thought Partnership for Peace was quite a clever way of handling it. But the more I talked to Central East Europeans, the more it became apparent that this wasn't going to work. Their sense of betrayal from the late 30s and also from Yalta was too strong, and they felt insecure. So it didn't surprise me when expansion happened, and I'm pretty convinced that by and large, NATO and EU expansion was a good thing, that it stabilized parts of Europe that would not otherwise have been that stable after collapse of the Soviet Union. And I also think there were ways of managing it with Russia, for example, through the Founding Act in 1997. Where did it go wrong? I think it went wrong in 3 ways. First, the failure to consult over Kosovo. I think that's where you start to see great suspicions develop between Russia and the US. And it's the point at which Putin starts to come into power as well. I wasn't opposed to the Kosovo policy, but and the Russians played quite a constructive role in the end in its conclusion, but we went ahead without consulting them. Secondly, the color revolutions. I think that had an enormous impact on Putin. I think that was the point where he started to fear the popular movement would be promoted in his mind probably by the West rather than authentically, legitimately from the countries themselves. So I think you from Georgia and Ukraine come very much into focus then as threats, because he doesn't want the same thing to happen in Russia. And the trouble really seems to me to start at that point. And the third thing I would say is the Bucharest summit of 2008, which was a shambles, because Bush wanted to offer Ukraine and Georgia membership, and Merkel was opposed. So we got the worst of both worlds. We neither offered you, we made it clear to Ukraine that they weren't going to be members, and so left them dissatisfied, while we put it on the table, so we added to Putin's concerns. And I think we're seeing from that a steady deterioration of relations, which culminates, I guess, in the events of 2013-14, where all of Putin's fears come together with Euromaidan, and he's already, while that's going on, talking about how NATO is going to get involved. Though the issue, as we know, in 2013 was the EU. Just a final point about Euromaidan. I mean, what's staggering when you look back at it from Putin's point of view is that he had in Yanukovych the most pro-Russian Ukrainian president he was likely to get. Yet in the summer of 2013, he put them into the most extraordinary economic squeeze in order to get him to refuse to to sign an association agreement with the EU, which, as we know, it wasn't going to lead to early EU membership. So, in a sense, his core miscalculation, I think, almost came at that point where he tried to bully Yanukovych into something that almost guaranteed his overthrow.
Julie, do you agree?
Yeah, I'd like to come back on that. I do agree with you. I also would just like to add to it a little bit. I would stress a little bit what you said towards the very end, and that it's an accumulation of all of these events. That NATO expansion on its own, I don't think, as particularly in the 1990s, the first round was the problem in itself. You had George Kennan, who was sort of the wise man of American foreign policy, who said back in the 90s that you will not like the Russia that you see if you enlarge NATO in this way. But I totally agree with you, Sir Lawrence, when you say Partnership for Peace, which was a program in 1994 that was meant to be sort of a holding tank where all of these Central and East European countries, including Russia, would be able to come and really get used to the idea of working with NATO countries and inside NATO, and also it was a way of bringing Ukraine and Russia together and convincing Ukraine eventually to get rid of its nuclear weapons.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is Russia still officially a NATO partner for this program? No.
No, the program, exists, but Russia's not. But it was, the ink was barely dry on, and also it was created by a man who was very much involved, the man who was the Secretary of Defense in the United States, William Perry, who really felt that that NATO expansion had to go slower in order to allow the Russians not to feel that their interests were being disregarded, in order to make them feel more included in the European security architecture process. And in fact, that didn't happen, because the very next year that Clinton signed the papers to go ahead with full NATO enlargement for the first round. Well, a lot of Russians whom I know who are in the scholarly world said, okay, we could accept that. We didn't like it, but we accepted it. But as Sir Lawrence said, it was really in 1999 with the bombing of Kosovo when that, no matter what we think of the horrific crimes that Milosevic was committing, nevertheless, they felt that, from the Russian perspective, that it was done, again, without participation, without enough consulting of the Russians, and it was against international law from their view. And it was a turning point of that we are now dismissed. And then as you have all these other events, Iraq, again, you can break international law and you have regime change by force. Well, then when you add that to the colored revolutions, as Sir Lawrence said, it looked like, from Putin's point of view, that the United States could come and do regime change in his own backyard and then all he needed to do was put NATO in Ukraine. So the obsession with Ukraine and the sovereignty is very much tangled up with this European security question, architecture question of being excluded. And my point is that had we handled that in a way that, just the way we handled post-war Germany, to bring Germany into the European security, well, into NATO, had we done more of that, thought more creatively about how to include Russia, we may not be here today. But we didn't. We dismissed the Russian interests right on through. And I don't think, I agree with Sir Lawrence, I don't think it was just NATO alone. And I want to stress that point. It's the accumulation of 30 years of these kinds of events. But the Russians made mistakes too. So I don't want to say it's all the West's fault either. I mean, it really was, this dismissing of East Central European and East European security needs and sovereignty all along as well.
This is a bit of a side note, but you, Julie, and you, Sir Lawrence, you both mentioned the color revolutions, quote unquote, as one of the triggers in Putin's mindset that got us here. But we talk about them. Let's just talk a little bit, because there is an argument that those revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, argument in the Kremlin, those were Western-sponsored regime changes, whereas essentially they were grassroots movements which received Western support indeed. And there's an argument among political scientists who actually studied those revolutions that it's impossible to actually change a regime through just fueling money and political technologies. And Alena, you've witnessed those revolutions. How much of those were indeed grassroots, and how important the presence of, to say, US congressmen on Maidan was?
Well, indeed, I was an active participant in both revolutions that were 10 years apart. The first one in 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution. I was then a first-year student of university studying political science, and of course, we being most politically active students, we went out into the streets to see what's actually going on and is this actually going to work? And having known very little about the dynamics of Ukrainian politics, we were thrown right into it and ended up conducting a revolution unknowingly. Back then, it's difficult for me to say now. I can't say that at 17 years old I comprehended which powers were at play. But I do remember that people were definitely inspired by the Georgian Revolution of Roses that happened just a couple of years ago. Ukrainians were always inspired to fight against corruption. I think that was always the #1 premise for Orange Revolution, to become freer, more independent, to have honest and legitimate government. I think that was #1 reason. At that point, it wasn't even about East or the West. It was more about, let's have a good governance in Ukraine because we want to live in a nice and civilized country. 10 years later, in 2014, basically in 2004, that's how my political career started, and it led me all the way to 2014 when I was already a leader of the regional party organization of one of the biggest political parties in Ukraine. And at that point, I was one of the organizers and coordinators of the protests. And that's when I could definitely tell you that there was no backing of the West whatsoever. We were hoping for some backing from the West. The protests arose from grassroots level, even below. It was the complete disappointment that after 10 years of those hopes that were raised in 2004 of becoming this full-right European democracy, whether through joining the EU or not, but just being part of this community, and nothing having come into fruition, and having one government after another and corruption scandals one after another, and Yanukovych coming back into power, and eventually people were actually not minding him as long as he was leading Ukraine towards the EU with signing the EU association agreement, which I agree with Sir Lawrence was still very far from the EU membership. It would take us at least 20 years from that point of successful development and growth to be a candidate to join the EU. We were really hoping at that time, starting from student protests, trying to get President to sign the association agreement, not take us back, And yes, at the end, we did find out that President Yanukovych was forced and then bribed by Putin and some international loans not to sign it. We took it to the streets. I guess that's the Ukrainians' first response to try to change something within the government. It worked once, and we took it to the streets the second time. And I do remember that we were happy to organize the protests, and there were certainly people willing to participate and take Ukraine further, up until the point when we saw that Yanukovych is not going to give up that easily. When he started deploying special forces to Maidan, and when people were forced to protect themselves and, you know, build these fortresses of tires, car tires, and when we had to decouple the streets and throw cobbles back at Kalashnikovs and protect ourselves with wooden shields, that's when we longed, we cried for help of the West. We begged senators to come to just protect us, to just be there, to go up on stage, say a few words of support, so that we know when they're there, special forces are not going to shoot. The president is not going to give away the order when the international community is there. And the most that we got, and you know, that was later used very actively by Russian propaganda when they were saying that Nuland was there giving away some, you know, hyped foods stuffed with whatever favorite narrative of Russian propaganda. That's all effectively the US has done. Nuland came to protesters, she expressed her support, and she went back home. And that's all we got. And at the end of the day, if you remember, President Yanukovych was arranged to stay in power through some concessions and compromises. And then again, that's when people went out into the streets and said, we're attacking the office of the president and we don't care what happens next.
But in retrospect, seeing how Russia reacted back then in 2014, reacted now by full-scale invasion, do you regret having those members of US Senate and Congress being there?
I don't think so. At the end of the day, it was a show of support, and they didn't produce any effect, to be honest. Maybe they've brought some faith to the Ukrainian people that actually we're not alone in our fight for democracy, and all of those statements being made somewhere far away in the West about, you know, US being the leader of the free world and they help all the people to win this democracy. Maybe that installed some faith and positivity into people and kept going, you know, for another extra week. But realistically, it didn't produce any change. The only change that was brought was the resolve of Ukrainian people and the willingness to sacrifice their lives during the peaceful protests in the 21st century.
I see. Thank you. Julie, you said that you don't want by any means to justify what is happening, but you also want to see a longer-term Russian perspective. There's one leader in Europe now who also wants to do that. It's French President Emmanuel Macron, and you also studied not only Russian but French foreign policy. What do you think Macron is trying to achieve? He talked to Putin even yesterday. He said he did that on the request of Ukraine's President Zelensky. Do you think he's trying to be a moral leader of Europe now in absence of Angela Merkel? Do you think he's been successful or he's failed? He was accused of appeasement for his engagement of efforts.
You know, it's a great question. I think Macron is following in the footsteps of Charles de Gaulle back from the 60s, when France was a leader of Europe that sort of led Europe, and when Germany was divided and couldn't speak for itself, led Europe more towards détente with the Soviet Union and ultimately entente and then détente and then entente with the Soviet Union in the early 1970s. It started in around 1966, and Macron is very much in that Gaullist mode of he is now head of the European Union, the rotating head of it, and so he's not only speaking for France, he is speaking for the European Union, and so he really is taking the mantle of Merkel in that sense, of being sort of the chief of the EU. And I think he is trying to do exactly what de Gaulle did, which is to mediate between Russia and the United States, Russia and NATO, and to try to find some European security solution, that to think about European security architecture in these lands in between, which go from the Arctic all the way through the most, certainly the most volatile and unsafe area, one of the most in the world today, but from the Arctic all the way down to the Black Sea, that between Europe and Russia, these what we call the lands in between, which is the Eastern Partnership, and Ukraine is one. And I think he wants to think about how to solve this European security architecture that is mutually acceptable for all sides. Russia's interest being taken into consideration, Europe's interest being taken into consideration, because I think he understands very clearly that no one is going to be secure unless there's a sense of mutual security. That Ukraine is very much rooted, it's the core of the European security problem, and if you don't solve the Ukrainian question in a way that is satisfactory to Ukraine and to all sides, both Russians and then we're never going to have peace. And he is not only, he's following in the Gaullist footstep, but I also think he has a real vision. It's not just for his own electoral. He's been accused of his own electoral because he's running for elections in April and May. He's not just about that. It's not just because it's all just about trying to make the EU an autonomous, actor. I think he genuinely believes that the only way to find peace for Europe is to find a mutually secure solution for a new European security architecture that is enduring. And so I applaud him for that. It's going to be very tough now, in particular after this war. It was hard enough before. It's now, I don't really think it's something we can talk about anytime soon. But yes. We're going to be talking about building up troops for now. Sir Lawrence.
Sir Lawrence, to you.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think Macron got unjustly accused of appeasement and so on, and it was fair enough. I think Putin used him. Putin will have had these long conversations with Macron after, as far as we can work out, he'd already recorded his invasion speech. So I think he was used by Putin, but that doesn't mean he was wrong not to try. I think he's got a problem in the language which Macron uses overstates what he can achieve, and probably what he is trying to achieve, and it creates nervousness in Northern Europe and those who are closer to Russia, because in the end they think the US and the alliance is a more reliable security provider than the EU and France. And so that, although you can also argue and should argue that NATO went through a near-death experience with Trump, and that may come back. So that in that sense, it makes sense to think about strategic autonomy. I think the other interesting player in this is Germany. There's a certain amount of analysis now which suggests that part of the problem was that Putin misread the German coalition, misread the coalition negotiations, didn't appreciate quite Baerbock's position as quite we could maybe kind of view the Greens are dovish, whereas this one's quite hawkish. But Germany is still in an exposed position, especially on the energy side, which we haven't talked about much yet, but I think is the big issue that's coming out of this. Is Europe's vulnerability, is its dependence on Russian energy. And one of the costs potentially for Putin is, now that this has been realized, over time it will wean itself away from this dependence. But at the moment, it's a real issue, and it's a problem for the German coalition. Also note that the German armed forces today have been pointing out quite explicitly there's been a lack of investment in them. So I think the French policy will carry on along the lines as stated. German policy is in flux, I think, and it'll be quite interesting to see how the coalition works this out, because this is a Social Democrat chancellor, and the Social Democrats were the inheritors of the Ostpolitik. There's a former Social Democrat chancellor working for Russia effectively at the moment. So I think there's some big issues that are going to be faced in Germany, probably even more so than France, I think.
You've just mentioned the energy dependence, and as you said, it's not going away anytime soon. Do you think it's going to limit, ultimately, long-term European and Western response to what happens next, and how much of a Cold War we are getting into? This is back to you, Sir Lawrence.
Yeah, sorry. I think what the Russians haven't quite, the Russians from last year have been putting a squeeze, which is why we've got such high energy prices now. They've got to work out how far they push this. They've got to, because obviously they can cut it off, but they haven't got anyone else to sell their oil and gas to at the moment. China's not available that easily as an alternative. So I think for Putin, he can make us pay, but it's quite tricky. I think, like a lot of the things, that when you start looking at the instruments of power that's available to Putin, they're all mixed. They don't quite have, they have their own blowbacks, and the energy instrument is one. But it's certainly been an important factor in inhibiting the response in the US, even as well as Germany.
How much time do we have for this? We're supposed to have up to an hour of the panel discussion, and we'll open this to the audience. So I wanted to ask how much of... Okay, we've used the hour. Okay, very briefly, if you allow, before we go to questions, I wanted to ask all three panelists, what is the way out of this crisis, in their opinion? Let's start with Julie.
What is the way out?
Yes. Is there a way out? And if there is, what is it?
Well, we gotta figure out how to stop this war first. If you had asked us, it would have been interesting. Just, even last week, obviously, we'd have very different answers. Even on Monday, we'd have probably very different answers. But at this point, I think we've crossed a Rubicon that we're going to have to push pause. But one of the things I think one of the things I can predict is going to happen is that Sir Lawrence talking about France and German foreign policies, I think that France will not really think of NATO quite as being as brain dead as he said some years ago, that it's not just going to be about European autonomous, it's going to be European focus on defense in conjunction far more with NATO, that it's going to be much more emphasis on defending Europe. And the transatlantic alliance, I suspect, will get stronger. I'll be interested to hear what Sir Lawrence has to say about all this. But that we're back to, I think, a sort of early 1980s style missile type crisis where we're going to line both sides with missiles. I mean, they're talking about putting nuclear weapons now in Belarus. I mean, the Russians are. I'm sure that we will begin to certainly, maybe we'll take away the Russia-NATO Founding Act to allow permanent bases in the new NATO states, and so forth and so on. I think we now are back to a very militarized Europe. How do we deal with that? So that's not necessarily a way out. At this point, I'm thinking about dealing with the reality that is now, I think, ahead of us imminently. I think we need to remember that engagement does not mean appeasement. The fact that Macron was called an appeaser because he at least acknowledges that the Russians did have up until, now it's really difficult to say this in this climate, the Russians did have some legitimate security interest in Europe. That just sounds laughable given what they've done. But Macron was acknowledging that and that's going to be for another day, but thinking about European security architecture, rebuilding it, we're not there yet. Right now, I think it's going to be mitigating risks, trying to keep inadvertent escalation as we manage this crisis, confidence building measures. Maybe if the United States is willing to continue the strategic stability talks, we had made some real progress in cybersecurity, strategic stability in terms of getting, the conventional forces in Europe treaty, thinking about that again, Vienna document, thinking about all that again. I'm not sure that we can go back to that now. That all might be put on hold, but I hope not, because now more than ever do we need to talk about strategic stability in this very dangerous time that is, I think, ahead of us.
Thank you. Alena.
I think my answer is going to be very not diplomatic, and the easiest way to end this is, of course, to get rid of the madman in Kremlin, which is sadly not realistic at this point in time. As a Ukrainian, of course, I would urge the world to help Ukraine as much as the world can. We do have enough of volunteers that want to fight for our land, and honestly, not just Ukraine, but the future of the whole Europe and the international rule-based order. That's what Ukrainians are fighting for now. We are lacking, however, some military weapons and armaments and defensive weapons, first and foremost. And that's been emphasized many times. Russian army is simply stronger and much more better equipped than Ukrainian army, even though we do still have less troops. But the morale is much higher than the Russian morale, just like Sir Lawrence said in the beginning. So Ukrainians are fighting for their land and they're willing to die for it. And I think that means a lot. Now, we all heard when Putin announced his invasion and his grand plans, he said, and he urged NATO members not to intervene and be very careful with their next steps. And I do believe that that was basically a coverted nuclear threat, which is quite viable. And just seeing what the madman is capable of, I could believe that that could happen anytime. And there were talks not just about Belarus. Ukrainian Minister of Defense has been saying for 5 years now that there is a high probability of Russia restoring nuclear potential of Crimea. Because when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, all the infrastructure still remained underground, and one of the strongest infrastructures was in Crimea. So they are capable of many atrocities, as we've seen. So I do think that the world, acting cautiously on one hand, is a smart thing to do, because we do not need a nuclear war in the world. On the other hand, just leaving Ukraine on its own is not an issue. I think we need to hurt Putin when it hurts the most, and that would be just sanction his closest friends, his closest allies. We have so many of them here in London. London has been basically a laundromat, Londongrad, Moscow upon Thames, you pick it. There's been so many metaphors for it. They're all here, all of their money are here, their families are here. And I think perhaps not cutting diplomatic ties, as Kyiv is urging. I'm not a diplomat, I'm not sure how effective that is. I would still like for that channel to be open for discussion. But cutting all of the illegitimate money is definitely the way to go. And crippling Putin's closest alliance to the core, where they can no longer sponsor the military invasion.
Sir Lawrence, would you endorse that?
This is a very dynamic situation. And I wouldn't, there's all sorts of possibilities at the moment. Putin is going to have to work out whether he doubles down, whether, they haven't yet taken a city. They've taken some towns, but not a lot. And, those of us who were watching a lot of the analysis that was being presented before this happened, told that this was going to be a real blitzkrieg, that this was going to be shock and awe. It isn't. So Putin has got to work out what he does and how far he's prepared to go. And he's got to persuade his military to have the plans and the wherewithal to do it. And, I and others are sort of thinking ahead and obviously the Ukrainians are thinking ahead to resistance and insurgency and so on, but he hasn't. We're not actually even at that one. It's only a couple of days in, but we're not at that point yet. And so this is dynamic, and this is could represent a major failure for Putin. And he's all dictators look safe until they're not, and until those around realize that actually this is somebody who is a danger to them and the country. So I'm not predicting. I think it'd be foolish to predict anything at all. But I do think it's dynamic, and I think the idea that we've got, as one would have said a few weeks ago, even that we've got potentially another 8 years of this, I find hard to believe. Apart from anything else, he looked pretty awful. I mean, I'm not sure he's even a well man. And this sort of ridiculous position of meters between him and his advisors. I think the situation could develop in quite unexpected and surprising ways, which could be dangerous. I mean, for the reasons also just been said, because for example, just today we had a lot of suggestions that the Finns and the Swedes really might now want to join NATO, and immediately threats come out of Moscow about the strong measures that will be taken. When you're in that sort of mood, and you've already taken some big risks, you may take more. So I think it's a question of doubling down, which is risky, or moving to a situation where the regime becomes vulnerable. Just one final point, I'd be interested in the others' views on this. There's been sort of vague murmurings of ceasefire talks and so on. And that's normally how wars like this conclude. The ceasefire is agreed, and maybe or maybe not, that leads to a peace settlement. Korea, there was a ceasefire in 1953. We still don't have a peace settlement. So just a ceasefire doesn't itself mean very much. But that's a way out of the problem. So that's one of the things I think one will be looking at if the Russians don't make more military progress soon, as to whether you see ideas floated of some sort of forces being disengagement of forces or something like that. So I think there's a number of, when you start this sort of thing, you never go just back to where you were before. Things are changing.
Okay. Well, let's open this now to the audience. I will give you now the microphone.
Yes, you should, so that the online audiences can hear the question.
Oh, yes, and the online audiences will also hear and ask the questions. So I am keeping the microphone. No, giving it.
Can we just have one extra? Oh, actually.
I guess you want us to introduce ourselves.
Yes, please.
Good. My name is Christopher McKenzie. I have business in Russia and in the Ukraine, 10,000 people in Russia, 15 people in the Ukraine. I spend most of my time worrying about my colleagues in the Ukraine.
What do you do, if I may?
We produce our services equipment in Russia and in the Ukraine. We refurbish sewers. It's a great business. Look, my starting point is that Putin is not an idiot. He's a smart guy. He hasn't got to where he got by being stupid, taking short-term measures. He's a brilliant tactician. He's not that great a strategist.
But what is your question?
There is not there is no question that he has been planning this for a long time. The issue that I thought you might have talked more about is what many of my Russian friends are saying, which is, yes, of course, this was about orange revolutions, etc., but it's fundamentally a generational thing. It's fundamentally that Putin and his cohorts are terrified by what they are actually seeing in Russia. And they are frightened about the instability of their own positions. And that, of course, the Ukraine is a superb example of what can happen when you let the younger generation loose. And that's, what do you want to call it? Okay, Ukraine. Ukraine is a wonderful example of what happens when you let the younger generation loose. So to come to Sir Lawrence's point, how do you deal with the fundamental issue which Putin is facing, which is his own existential problem? Because if we don't deal with that, we will never have peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, Julie, do you want to take this? Yeah.
So really you're saying that Putin feels threatened by the younger generation. It's a generational problem. That's the essence of your question, right? The point? I mean, I agree with you to the extent that I think he is part of that generation that witnessed the end of the Soviet Union, and the people who are with him in his National Security Council are all about the same generation. Narishkin, Patrushev, Bortnikov, they're all about the same age. And I think this sense of loss and resentment, and as he uses in Russian the word for swindled all the time. He feels that the West has swindled him, and that somehow the Soviet Union, the way it collapsed, and all this, that he feels quite betrayed. The whole thing was a betrayal. One of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century, that kind of thing. So I think in that sense he's and now over the last 30 years or 20 years that he's been in power, this revanchism has been aroused in him, a sense of irredentism has been aroused in these kinds of instincts have been aroused in Russia because of this action-reaction dynamic that we've discussed today, that between Russia and the West over the last 30 years, that explains the intense sense of humiliation, resentment, a sense of revenge. And I think it's all crystallized now over Ukraine. He's obsessed with Ukraine. There's no question about it. I mean, his histrionics and his history lessons. I mean, he even gave the treatise, as I'm sure you all know, the treatise that he wrote in July, he gave it to all his soldiers to read. And it's quite insane, to study. And then the kind of unhinged speech that he made on Monday night about Ukraine's history that is very cherry-picked and that failed the fact-checking task quite a bit. But I think it's not just it is a generational thing in that sense, in that they lament. It's not that he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union per se, because as he once said, you don't have a brain if you want to rebuild it, but you don't have a heart if you don't feel the pain. But the way the last 30 years, and he feels that the West has treated Russia, trying to rebuild great power, because he associates державность, or great power, with security. They're completely intertwined, that Russia must be a great power in order to defend itself. So he's of that generation of, great powerness for Ukraine to become a NATO member, that hits at, it not only would not make Russia a great power anymore, because it would lose its most important, brother in a way, and it hits at Russian great powerness, but it hits at Russian sovereignty and security. He is of that generation. But the young people, there are an awful lot of young people who have imbibed that as well. I work with a lot of them, and the foreign policy community. But so I don't know if I'm not sure that if you just put the whole Russian foreign policy young people community in charge, that they're going to feel that differently about how Russia, they still carry that resentment and that sense of wanting to correct the European security architecture so that Russia has its say-so in its own backyard. So yes, it's generational, but I don't think completely. No?
Let's open to further questions, yeah. And we'll agree to disagree. Okay.
Is this on? Yes. So I think this follows on actually quite nicely from the conversation we just had. And my question is, to what extent do you think Putin's perception of his legitimacy in Ukraine among the Russian population is informed by the history? So I'm thinking specifically of the Kievan Rus with Rurik and then Oleg from the 880s to the 1200s. So obviously that was the founding place in Russia, from what I understand. And then all the way up until 1917, that was the first semi-recognition of Ukraine as an independent state. So do you think that the Russians actually take a long view of their history and their identity and therefore their legitimacy in the Ukrainian space? Thank you.
I think it's a very complex question, but if I understand it correct, I think it will be interesting to talk about Russians and the connection views on Ukraine's history. But also, I think Putin has claimed many times that a whole lot of people in Russia agree with in Ukraine, Russian-speaking people in Ukraine feel oppressed and agree with him. Alena, would you take this one?
Just to cover the Russian speakers in Ukraine and to tick that off the list, the answer is very short and simple. Russian speakers in Ukraine do not feel oppressed. Perhaps there's an extremely small number of people that have been influenced by years of propaganda pouring at them from Russian state-owned TV channels, where they hear all the atrocities that Nazis in Kyiv are doing. The most ridiculous things have been said by this point, and I'm not going to regurgitate that. I come from the region in the West, where we both speak Ukrainian and Russian, because we're so multinational. There used to be, now they're all in Israel, but there used to be a massive Jewish community. We had Armenians, Turkish, Russians, Moldovans, Romanians, Ukrainians, in one common language for everyone was Russian. And it's same goes for almost every region in Ukraine. There are Russian speakers everywhere. Every single Ukrainian is both Ukrainian and Russian speaker. So there is no oppression. I do think that perhaps Ukraine has made some mistakes, for example, with implementing law on language. With even there was criticism about cutting out national minorities' languages from educational programs, but even that was dictated, for example, by the fact that Romanian community in the region where I come from, they were saying, can we please have Ukrainian language classes earlier? We actually don't want our kids to be just Romanian speakers up until 5th grade and all the classes to be in Romanian, because they then are much lower in the grade when it comes to going into the universities. They're simply not as strong grammatically. So can we please pull that forward and give them a better education? So, of course, many mistakes have been made. In terms of interpreting history, I'm not going to go into long essays like Putin does. I think it's very clear and it's so obvious that Kyivan Rus was there in the 9th century, and there's a reason why it was called Kyivan. It was the center and the cradle for the civilization of all the Slavs. And even us in Ukrainians would never try to claim that it was us Ukrainians first, and then all the other nations spread from us. No, it was the beginning of the statehood, which every single little community took away that experience with them, and they went on into the north, into now Belarus. They went into Novgorod, closer now Moscow. They went all the way and spread that idea of statehood from Kyivan Rus. And if we look back at history, it took 4 centuries from Kyiv to Moscow being founded. So I think it's that there's not really much to elaborate on. We are happy to share that history. We don't want to privatize it. We don't claim that we're the supreme nation or anything of that sort, but we also need to calm everyone down who wants to claim that superiority, because we always find ourselves equal with Belarusians, with Russians, and with all the other former Soviet Union states.
Thank you, Alena. And I just will add very briefly from myself that there's very interesting research done in the whole ideas of Russian, Ukrainian statehood, Kyiv and Rus, and actually all the studies show that the idea of Moscow being a successor to Kyiv and Rus was developed in Kyiv in 18th century by those Russian, Ukrainian monks and scholars who wanted to sort of give a new meaning to the Russian Empire. But yeah, let's go. There was a bunch. Yeah, I think. Go ahead.
A lot of foreign policy experts seem to keep getting caught with their pants down because they have a rationalist bias. So Tony Brenton did a mea culpa recently, mentioned Dmitry Trenin. But when we listen to Putin's speeches, we hear him calling people Nazis, threatening use of nuclear weapons, talking about religion. So does the foreign policy world need to ditch this rationalist bias and maybe become better Freudians or something?
Oh, wow, that's such a great question. I'm delighted for that question. In a word, yes. I come from Oxford that has a very eclectic approach to international relations theory. Just for everybody in the room, there are many schools of thought of how to understand foreign policy, and the one that's dominant, particularly in Russia, is what's called realism. And there, I think Putin and his, certainly the foreign policy community around him is very much influenced by this way of thinking that says that, you know, everything is about security and it's all, and ideas don't really matter. In actual fact, when you, and I don't know if you teach this at King's, if you taught this at King's, Sir Lawrence, but certainly we tended to be raised, educated with more of an eclectic approach that ideas matter, psychology matters as well, you know, even leadership matters. It's all the interaction of everything. So this very much of a rational foreign policy, or we call realist foreign policy, sure, that absolutely matters. You can probably tell in the way I even talk that I've been trained in this. Nevertheless, as we see from Putin, you cannot dismiss the ideas in the head. Gorbachev is a good example of this. There was a huge debate after the Gorbachev eras. Did Gorbachev do what he did because he had no choice? It was, you know, material factors, the economy, the collapse of the military and all that drove him to reform, or was it because of the democratic, the transformation of his ideas that led him to do it? Ultimately, I think the answer to your question is it's usually a mix, and it's an interaction of the two. And you can't really, the interesting thing is trying to measure the relative weights and just to really tease out the interaction between those different forces that cause someone like Putin to behave the way he behaved. A little bit like Alyona said earlier, well, for you, it was mostly about Putin's, he acted the way he acted because of the domestic situation in Russia, you know, when the economy goes down and all that. I don't deny that to be true at all. I also think it is about security as well. Again, it's the interaction between them. But there you have huge debates in the United States between people who say, oh, it's all just about him worrying about regime change and his domestic popularity, and especially as the economy declines. And others say, no, it's just all about security. And then others, you say it's all about him, you know, his imperialism. Well, in actual fact, or just the ideas that he has in his head. And I think it's very difficult to tease out the relative weights of this, but we have to keep all these factors in mind as we think about what drives him.
A rational framework is consoling as well, I would say that.
Yes, it allows you to pretend that you can predict what's going to happen, but we see that rational theory has not really helped us predict Putin's. Well, it has in a way. I mean, and you could argue that Putin's intensely rational what he's done. As Sir Lawrence said, he may have just miscalculated. I don't think he is emotional, but I do think he behaved in a way that was quite rational. I think coronavirus has affected him a lot. There's this sort of bunker mentality of being alone for the last 2 years, and as Sir Lawrence said, he's kind of gotten almost weird about his health, and and that may have affected him. But this is a grim kind of rational reasoning that he's got, and he's convinced for a number of reasons that the West would capitulate if he pressed hard enough. He miscalculated, but it was very rational.
Sir Lawrence, was it rational or irrational?
I mean, I agree with a lot of that, and I think it's probably true that international relations scholars, foreign policy experts, I mean, we're trained in a sense to be analytical and look at choices and work out optimum policies and so on, because somebody's got to. I mean, this is what a specialist should do. But here we've got a situation of an autocracy, and I think this makes a big difference. If you're looking at the French or the German or the British or the American political systems, what you're looking at is a lot of pulling and hauling between different actors in the system. And what you get out of it is not necessarily always coherent, but you can see where it comes from and why the decisions take the form they do. Now, occasionally you have someone like Trump, where again, you're having to engage in analysis of him and his psychology as much as the policies. But there's one way to judge rationality, and that is there a relationship between the different elements of what he's saying? Are the objectives going to be met by the means available? So basic strategic rationality. And the problem with this case from the start was it was never clear why that was going to be the case. And what you have is a befuddled mind in some ways. That many of us think, well, these are the normal pretexts that a Russian might use. Ukraine isn't really a state; it's artificial. There isn't a national identity, and so on. But if you actually believe that, then you miscalculate badly. And I fear that's possibly what's happened. So in his own terms, he's rational. I would say I talked to a couple of people the other night who dealt with Putin a decade or so ago, and they thought he was almost unrecognizable in many ways, that his capacity has deteriorated, that he's sort of become much more bitter and paranoid, or however you want to put it, that he was a much easier and smart and clever person to deal with.
Macron said that as well, didn't he?
Yes. We have another question down there, I think.
Hi, is this on?
I think so.
Regarding the question of regime change.
No, I don't think it's on.
Is that on?
Yes.
Correct. Regarding the question of regime change, and those of us who do have friends and families out there, obviously we're very concerned about that. You hear particularly lurid rumours from US intelligence, for example, that the Russians have a kill list. They will clamp down on particular minorities, gay people, etc. I was wondering how realistic you think it is that the Russians could even actually do that if they want to, given that there are 44 million people, and to what extent they do actually want to, or to what extent are they just going to try and change the top of the regime and run away?
So the first part of the question, is it, do we believe in a kill list, essentially?
Yeah, is there actually a kill list?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that we don't know at this point, and I will give the panelists a chance to answer that. The second part was, what was the second part?
Regime change?
Oh yeah, regime. I just wanted to address the regime change. I think it has been stated a few times during the day-to-day by Russian officials in Ukraine that Russians' stated goal, it's official now. I think Foreign Minister Lavrov said that they want to change the government in Kyiv. So I don't know if whether any of you want to add on the kill list.
Not the kill list, but probably topic closer to me, the regime change in Ukraine. That has been the primary goal as per the countless intelligence reports, and now it's been even voiced by Russians themselves. There is Ukrainian intelligence that there's currently a diversion group in Kyiv operating, which is sent there specifically to assassinate President Zelensky. There has always also been spread misinformation about the fact that he fled Kyiv, and that made him go out into the streets from his administration to show the people that he's still there, and he's leading this resistance, he's not hiding away. Now, if there's going to be a change of government or installment of a new regime, it's definitely going to be a military regime. There's no way that Russia can install a puppet government even, because it's not going to sustain. There is absolutely no way. And the two people that were even named by Liz Truss, which I'm not going to name the last names, but one is at least trying to look as a presentable politician, but he has some 3% support rating. The other one is, sorry, a complete joke, who doesn't even live in the country anymore. There is absolutely no chance that any sort of puppet government would survive in Ukraine for long, because Ukrainians have proved many and many times again that they could get rid of the government that they don't like. And in this situation, when Ukrainians are mobilized and they have weapons on their hands, there's no way that any puppet government will survive. The military regime, however, is a totally different situation, and that is in effect an occupation. And that is a serious threat, but I do hope that it's not going to come to that. And I think, again, just due to the fact that Russians have not been as successful as they planned to be, the reason why President Putin is mad, I think the reason why they're even offering now to have the negotiations platform in Minsk again, I think they're seeing that they're not quite catching up with the agenda they had in the beginning. So that's also a good and reassuring sign.
Do we have any time left?
I mean, as far as we are concerned, we can go on and on. So it's up to the panelists and you.
How do you guys feel? Let's do 2 more questions. Yeah.
Okay, we have actually one question online, so it will be fair to address these. And the person with initials MS asks, how will this war affect Russian public opinion about Putin in the medium term? Will it change enough for a major internal uprising, or maybe his close allies to turn on him?
Do you want to take this?
Sure. That's something I've been thinking a lot about, at least looking at the poll data. The latest Levada poll shows, which was in December, showed, so a long time ago now, even though it's really not, but it is, it's like a whole nother century ago, shows that the majority of Russians blamed the United States and NATO and Ukraine for inciting or being the cause of the problem, and that about 66% all totaled of Russians were blamed it all on the United States, NATO, and Ukraine together. About 50% the United States and NATO. Now, I think the feeling is too, amongst the poll data that I also gathered today, is that most Russians will go ahead and go along with this, even though they may not agree with it, because of the fear of losing your job, the fear of, just the increased repression, which we've seen in just the last couple of years, and particularly even in the last year. So that there's very little space to protest, very little. I mean, we were talking earlier beforehand about how easy it is, even just last night, you show up on Pushkin Square, and the next thing you know, you're in a paddy wagon, even if it's, so it's very, very difficult to protest. There have been some journalists, one of my favorite journalists, or you guys may know her, Yelena Chernyenko, she worked for Kommersant, or works for Kommersant, and she was the main Ministry of Foreign Affairs correspondent for them. She was just taken off of that because she posted on her Instagram account that she was in solidarity with Ukraine and that she opposed the war. So, it's very, very difficult, I think, for Russians, whether you're professionals or just your average Russian person, to really stand up against it. I don't know whether that's going to translate. And also there's just a lot of apathy. Apparently there's a feeling like there's nothing we can do anyway. That's what the poll data shows. If this is going to change when body bags start coming back, and when they, and as Alyona and Sir Lawrence have said, things aren't going nearly as well in Ukraine, and this may begin to shift. But I don't see, given what we know thus far, there being any major sort of Bolotnaya type upheaval the way there was in 2010 to 2011. Or was it 11-12? Yeah, 11-12, sorry. It's just hard to imagine because the machine is just so much more repressive than it was then. But, I could be wrong. You probably know better than I do, being a Russian citizen yourself and having just come back. But that would be my guess, is that the repression machine will work for now.
Well, I did not expect the protest to be held in at least 54 cities, which was the case tonight. So.
Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to add too. Yeah, there are protests in 54, and also one of the things that I would add to that question, sorry about this, is that over 100 regional deputies signed a protest, said that go out and protest this war. There's a regional deputies from St. Petersburg, your town, Moscow, Saratov, and I've forgotten where else. But I think that's the place to look, and I think that's going to be the Kremlin's weak link. They're very worried about the regions always and what the regions do. And the fact that you have this is a rumbling, something that I don't think they expected.
Thank you, Julia.
Just make it. It's just worth noting. I saw that Peskov's daughter was amongst those who put up a sort of Instagram opposing the war. Wow. There's a lot of the younger elite are opposing the war. I think you're absolutely right in terms of general public opinion. There seems to be a rallying around the flag, etc., etc. But I've been struck by how many quite high-profile figures are opposing this. And Putin is not insensitive to public opinion. Like most autocrats, he doesn't really know what's out there, and he's probably quite scared of it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I would just add to that I agree. A lot of people who are prominent but never have been brave or outspoken have been outspoken on this. Surprising to many. Okay, let's do one last question.
I'm interested in the question of the timing of what's happened in the last couple of days, because I think arguably this could have happened at any time in the last 8 years. So I'm interested in your view about why now. And I've been thinking that perhaps there was some sort of trigger to bring this invasion forward. And I'm interested in a view about whether this trigger happened in the last 3 months, in the last 3 weeks, in the last 2 days. Interested in your view on timing of why it's happening now.
So, Lawrence, do you want to start with this?
I mean, I think the timing is extremely interesting. As far as we can work out, Putin embarked on this last summer. There's a variety of factors were relevant, including his belief that Biden might be the person who would negotiate in a way that Trump couldn't, some solution to all of this. He produced that strange essay in July in which he's sort of denying the validity of Ukraine. I mean, a lot of the things he said the other day was in this long essay. So you have that. You have Belarus, I think, is a very important factor in all of this. The operation depends quite a bit on Belarus being available. Lukashenko is culpable. I mean, if you can have the war criminals in this, Lukashenko is one as well as Putin. And Belarus being sort of captured almost is an important part of this as well. Kazakhstan, you can add to this. But I think given that he seems to have scripted what was going to happen right up to almost the last detail, including the final provocation in quote marks, the issue is, to some extent, could anything have been done since this was set in motion that would have stopped it? I mean, the timing is, the day after the Beijing Winter Olympics stop, the day when nuclear drills have just taken place, when there's naval, I mean, everything is sort of geared to this particular time. So I think it's basically a combination of intense frustration with a loss of strategic advantage and with an inability to implement Minsk in a way that meets his objectives. Maybe just a sense that time is running out for him, that if he doesn't act now, he'll never be able to reverse what of all the tragedy for him of the collapse of the Soviet Union is probably the biggest tragedy.
Alena, what is your perspective on that? Did you read that summer article on Ukraine being the same people with Russia, and you thought that's the end, or?
Thank you. Well, I did manage to read through it, even though it was quite painful. Many people did say that that was the declaration of war, factually. I do think there's a combination of factors. First, if we look at dates, yes, the end of the Beijing Olympics. Yes, that coincided with the 8th anniversary of Russia first invading Crimea. And looking back at history, that went down quite well for Putin. So he wanted to build on that positive experience, which actually led to his support being increased amongst the Russian population. They felt like they were one great nation, again, according to polls. So I think he wanted to correlate to that. That was the day of the reunification of Crimea. And that's when it started, the 20th of February. Then we saw there was 23rd of February, which is the day of the defender of the homeland in Russia, as many here know. So that's when he made his big speech, kind of mobilizing all the soldiers and the military against Ukraine, now we know. In terms of generally speaking and more strategically, I do think I agree with Sir Lawrence, first of all, and I do agree with Christopher saying that it all came down to the fact that Putin felt like he's running out of time. He felt like he needs to raise stakes constantly, and he kept raising stakes. If we look back at young generation coming through, I'm not quite the generation of independence. I was still caught in several years of Soviet Union. But I do see people that were born after 1991. They have no imagination of what it's like living under dictatorship. They're built completely differently. I'm looking at my 19-year-old sister. She's completely different from me, even though we come from the same family. They're wired differently. And of course, that generation coming up, it kind of, it breaks the ceiling, and it breaks through those ceilings. We could see that in Ukraine with 2004 and 2014. We saw that in Belarus, which I'm sure frightened President Putin. And, you know, Lukashenko managed to clamp down on opposition and oust them out of the country. And he was extremely brutal all the way through it. And I hope history comes back to his crimes at one point too, because the way he acted with his nation is just unthinkable. We saw Kyrgyzstan before, we saw Kazakhstan just this year. I think that also contributed to Putin's fears, because essentially, if you look at it, yes, there has been transition of power in Kazakhstan, but again, the generation that came up that were born at the end of the Soviet Union and in the independent Kazakhstan, they think differently. Kazakh people are very well educated. Many of them have gone through education in the West. They're not happy with them just living in the poor country while looking at, you know, elites feeding off of the natural resources of the country. All of that contributed to Putin thinking, okay, situation is actually changing drastically, and him being stuck in time, him trying to go to his third term and fourth term, and, you know, ground zero in his constitution, relaunching his whole presidential campaign, desperately trying to freeze time, which does not stop. The world moves forward, whereas Putin is stuck in time.
And we will give the last word to Julie.
No, I totally agree with you. Putin is stuck in time. And also, just to your point on generational stuff, I agree with you. I work with the younger generation and see a different category, or certainly the poll data also even shows that they want to join or have good relations with the West. They're much more globalized, very concerned with climate change, and wanting to stay part of the sort of global community. I just am concerned that if we don't deal with the kinds of grievances that are there, I see the foreign policy community, the young people, that those same kinds of grievances are still there. And so if you put them in charge, I'm not sure that you'll have a fundamentally different, you'll have a better foreign policy, it probably won't be nearly, it wouldn't be as nearly as aggressive, but those grievances are still there, and I'm not sure you'd have a radically different relationship with the West. So it's going to take both sides to fix that. That's basically my point about the generational thing. But about the timing, I just want to add one other thing to both your point, Aliona, and to what Sir Lawrence said, and that is I think Afghanistan plays a role in this as well, and that Putin, you know, he is worried about, I think subliminally time is running out, and that he wants to solve this. He's intensely frustrated, as Sir Lawrence says, because Minsk was not working out. Zelensky is becoming more and more hardline. Putin thought at first Zelensky might cooperate. It turns out he wouldn't at all. So intense frustration combined with an opportunity of Afghanistan. And this gets to their sort of worldview, which is, to your point about the older generation, they believe, this generation definitely believes that the United States is on the decline. That it's polarized, and it's also now in competition with China. So it's no longer the unilateral preeminent power. And so now Russia, with China on the rise and Russia right behind it, Putin feels this is his chance. And Afghanistan, that shows that the United States will withdraw if they're forced to. You know, if the situation is forced, they will capitulate. And that it is weak, and it's pulled back. Their Afghanistan moment was to say, right, seize the day, let's go in, let's get what we want in changing the European security architecture, let's get NATO out of Ukraine and Ukraine out of NATO, and it's not going to get any easier. Biden, as Sir Lawrence said, is a good person to work with. He's much easier than Trump. It's not because he's necessarily weak, it's because he's a realist, he's a rationalist, is what they say about Biden. So this is the moment, it's this now or never. And so I think that then you have that July paper in Ukraine, which is the start of all this. And here we are.
I think this is coming to a conclusion. I wanted to thank our panelists, Sir Lawrence, Aliona, Julie, and I wanted to thank you all for being here tonight. And I wanted also to thank those who were watching this via video link. Thanks so much.